are we offloading too much of our thinking to the AI? She starts off by saying how convenient AI is. You have this box at your fingertips where you just throw in a prompt, and in some cases within split seconds an answer comes out. This is a very powerful tool. In a lot of cases you're being encouraged to use the AI. Some elements of peer pressure involved here. She brings up an interesting point about how prior to AI we were using search engine, and in fact if you go back in time, this is an article from 2008 posted by The Atlantic, you'll see that they were saying this about Google search, right? Is Google gonna make us stupid? Because pre-Google, think about all the effort you had to put in to figure some shit out. You had to read some books, ask people. There was a good amount of effort that went into every question. And so if you had a dumb question like how many ants can fit inside a car muffler, this question would take you forever to figure out, right? You'd have to get some dimensional information. You'd have to hope there's some resource that is specialized in this specific question. And in some cases, you won't get nothing at all, right? Like, let's ask this question to GPT today. What do we get? Somewhere around 100K to 500K ants. And it even gives you reasonably responsible metrics for how it obtained it, right? Dumb questions like this, I would have never bothered to go down and look for. But now it's like, dude, you get this right here and there. And part of the problem here is this thing won't tell you you're asking a dumb question. So there's actually something to be said about what it's making us think about. The article here from 2008, let's investigate what it was saying about Google search. I'm not thinking the way that I used to think. I can feel it most strongly when I'm reading. Immersing myself in a book or a lengthy article used to be easy. My mind would get caught up in the narrative or the turns of the argument, and I'd spend hours strolling through long stretches of prose. And so he's really harping on the idea of attention span being impacted by the ease of something like a search engine. And there's really something to be said about false feelings of learning. If somebody were to tell you, hey, you should read this book. Pre-Google even, what you would have to do is read the damn book. You couldn't check them on this because you had to go through this process. There was some information that might have been like on the back of the book. So if you were fortunate enough to, be in a library that had the book, certainly you could get some details. But to find out like what the sentiment of the world is when it comes to this book, this was what you had to do. I have a little bit of pushback on this. I think our brains are really wired to determine what matters and discard the rest. And this is really a necessary human skill, right? You wouldn't be able to store everything in your brain. That's just not possible. Also think about the things you have to do every day, right? You've got certain things on your agenda. If you didn't have this ability to kind of facilitate what is important and what isn't, you wouldn't be able to live your day. And so in some cases, right, this article is harping on the loss of attention span. But I would argue that maybe your brain is doing what it's supposed to and saying, hey, we don't really need, because think about it. If I throw in a prompt or a question to this box and out comes the answer, I'm not going to think to remember this part. In the case of the book, there's so much time invested to finding that information out that it's like your brain was telling you, dude, if I don't remember this, I'm going to have to spend 2 hours trying to get it again. And there's this discussion here from Socrates of all people. And even back then, there was question on whether writing was doing this, right? So this is a quote from Socrates. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir, not of memory, but of reminding, and you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom, for which they will read many things without instruction, and therefore seem to know many things. They are not wise, but only appear wise. This really begs the question of what does it mean to be smart? But at least, in the case of this context here, and also the context of this article that was talking about Google search, it feels as though a lot of people attribute smart to being unassisted knowledge. This is how I would describe it, at least from the articles I'm seeing here. And so if we really treat smart as being unassisted knowledge, yes, there is some degradation there. But let me tell you this, if I were to ask you how many ants can fit in a muffler, if you're not able to answer this, am I going to think you're not smart? Absolutely not, right? So it's a weird question of what we deem to be smart and what we deem to not be. I think definitely no matter what, we are losing some form of memory here. However, you could argue because you don't know the answer to this question, you're almost smarter for not knowing this, right? Because if you think about your brain as a limited amount of space, certainly there's a limit to how much memory you have easily accessible. Like if you think of these as tiers, where as you go down in tiers, it becomes harder and harder to retrieve. And so tier 1 might be the things that you most recently learned, or the things that you work with on a daily basis for a long period. And then it goes down and down and down. This is a limited amount of space. You can't store everything you've ever learned in the tier 1 area, right? This is not scientifical, by the way. My example from kind of a computer hardware perspective, where it's like this is your L1 cache, your L2 cache, and so forth. And so by not wasting your time storing this in your tier 2 and tier 1, you could store other things, like maybe how not to touch a hot stove. Like this is something you would want in your L1 cache or something, right? You don't want to risk this being forgotten. But there's more to it than this. This article here that kind of talks about the death of the creator middle class. I think part of this can be attributed to AI because of how prolific a lot of these fields are now with new content, especially videos and art. And he kind of discusses how, the average creator earnings went up, however, the median went down. And it makes sense, right? Because there's so many people, and as the disparity gets larger and larger and larger, now this was definitely a thing pre-AI. I don't think we can disregard that. But certainly, as more and more people are able to produce content, scope goes way, way higher. And so on the topic of AI, the article mentions that lack of article viewership, site traffic is effectively eaten by AI, right? This is essentially what the article is alluding to. And I think it really depends on your medium, right? I think when it comes to articles and things like this, yeah. I think videos are pretty hard to get to that point. People tend to be against AI videos and music and art in general, which, you could argue blogs are art for sure. But key part here, right, is that AI isn't replacing the writers, it's replacing the reader. And it really becomes a point where to compete in this space, you must use some form of AI. Because think about it, right? If you're, let's say, for example, an article provider, you're not prioritizing the ability for the AI to parse your website and extract the information and keeping it token efficient and all this stuff. You're literally sacrificing your entire business model. Because if you go to Google right now, like let's try this. Article about living as a human being. Here, this right here is what's replacing a lot of people's careers because they can't get traffic to their website, right? They could just get this information here. Is AI making us more stupid? Is it making us dumber? I think really there's two camps with AI. There's the whispering ear user, and there's the balls to the wall, and there's the all-in user. I think the whispering ear user, you can kind of see this as somebody who uses it as an assister or uses it as a tool. And so like in the case of programming, they have it write the code, but they're still interacting with it in a very connected way. They might use it for a second look, right? If you're sending out an email, you may not have it write your email, but you might have it proofread it and make sure there's no like major mistake. You might even have it give you some advice on grammar, that kind of a thing. And then you have, the all-in user where it's like, let Jesus take the wheel. And I think this is the scariest user of all because a lot of the times they won't even, proofread it. It's just, hey, give me the answer, and they just trust it. I would like to think most people are not doing this. I hope. I think most people are in the camp of the whispering ear. I think it depends on what they're doing, right? If I'm doing something more important, for me, I always have to use some skepticism when I'm working with the AI. If it's something that's like non-important, say I'm just like sending a text message to somebody and it's like there's no right or wrong type of answer, I would be more in this camp. But even then, I find myself hard to believe everything it says. And kind of going back to this Google article, I felt this way even forever, right? I think even with Google search, I'm always skeptical. If I read source A and it tells me one thing, typically I'm assuming, I vet this source. There's certain sources that I trust more than others and yada yada, right? I've used the internet my whole life, and I don't think this has ever changed for me. And I think most people, when they're doing anything important, their brain is leading them down this path. I would hope anyway. Now there's this article here from Thinking Machines. It's pretty recent. When it comes to thinking machines, their goal is to kind of keep people in the loop. And right here it talks about how artificial intelligence can do more every day, but deciding what it should do is up to us, individuals, organizations, humanity as a whole. These decisions require knowledge and judgment, and people acquire through continuous contact with the work, increasingly done alongside AI. And so they really take the angle of the whispering ear. We believe the future worth building is human, shaped by human knowledge, guided by human will, and decided by human judgment. What follows is the case for that future and the work we're doing to bring it about. I think the biggest fear here is that as AI gets better and better, more people are ending up in this camp. And I think the problem really manifests itself when you're working on something that you're not familiar with, right? Let's say, for example, you're a web dev and you're working on low-level programming. You're more likely to end up in this camp of the all-in user just because you don't have much surface level knowledge. And I think that's the biggest risk here, right? If we look at our capabilities pre-AI, it felt like with something like low-level programming, it felt like we had much more granular focus on one thing. So like, let's say you were someone who specialized in OS, you might have a very specific skill set of writing drivers or something, right? This is just an example. But with that, your depth of other things like web, embedded, BIOS, right? Your knowledge of these other things wouldn't go as deep as that one specific thing that you were focused on. So if you were somebody who specialized in low-level programming for driver code, your depth went down to here, and you were okay with not knowing much else outside of that, right? You were okay with this being the deepest level of knowledge that you had. And so I would say this is how it is pre-AI, but now with post-AI, you run into a case where you never go this deep, never this low in the tree. And so now it feels like a lot of people are kind of in this camp post-AI, but they never let themselves really understand a granular part of anything. And so they end up with a lot of knowledge, but none that is deep enough. And so we have a case of people that are really good at high-level knowledge, but if you ask them anything deep about any of these, they're not going to be able to get it to you right away. Now the question is this a bad thing? Is this really a problem, or is it actually a benefit? Let's think about the benefits that you get. More versatility. Right, I could take a guy, in this example, when, we were going as deep as driver code, this guy wasn't able to context switch over to these other nodes very quickly. But now with post AI, the latency, because if we assume that there's some latency associated with going from this part to here, this was way higher pre-AI than it is now because we just never get that deep. And so I could take somebody who's good at OS and I can instantly bring them over here. Yes, they're not going to know the lowest level, but that's where the AI comes in, right? The AI is meant to handle this part here. At least supposedly. And so while you do get versatility, the problem you don't get, you're sacrificing unassisted knowledge. If we go back to the definition of what being smart is, which I already erased it, but the idea of unassisted knowledge being what makes you smart, yes, this is absolutely sacrifice. However, if we look at the big picture, right, if we look at the actual output from user A and user B, there are certain cases where this post-AI person is going to generate more output. While on the high level, this is what it looks like, right? It looks like the post-AI person is generating a lot more. Obviously, there's a lot of mess in this. If you ask them any question about something specific, they're not going to have an answer to it. Whereas this pre-AI person, they're going to know well deep into the knowledge. And so I think it becomes a question of what you're doing. There are certain cases where it benefits you to stay at a higher level and you can be versatile. Right? I'm thinking small teams, things where it's, a lot of moving parts, but there's benefits too where it is better to be localized into one thing. As far as does AI make us dumber? Will we become more stupid? I think the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. If you view smart as unassisted knowledge, yes, we are going to be impacted by this. There's no doubt. And so, yes, we would be dumber. However, if you view smart as adaptability, I would say otherwise. I think you can become more adaptable through the use of AI, but you're always going to need that assistance. And so the question is what do you do if you don't have internet? Are you screwed? How are you going to get an answer to your question when you don't have the internet at that point? So there's cases like this that actually do happen where it's like, yeah, you would wish you had somebody that didn't mess too much with AI. I think there are some cases where we're going to lose some focus, right? Pre-AI, we might have had better skills at doing things like this, but now it's like we don't need to. We can just have the AI do the shape filling here. Personally, when I use AI, I always focus on it as a whispering ear. And so like in this example over here, if I'm working on something where I'm at a complete high level, like this is here, I always try to make sure I'm putting an effort into understanding before I go deeper. So if I'm tasked with developing code for BIOS, yes, I could just have it prompt and have it generate everything for me and not understand the interfaces and the APIs and all that. Or I can spend time actually having a good understanding of it and then do that, right? So you have that power afforded to you. Fish article continues, one could argue that if you offload mundane thinking to AI so that you can do other more important thinking, perhaps it is something that increases life satisfaction and productivity, right? And it kind of goes into the idea that, hey, yes, we are sacrificing, but maybe it's for the better. Are we offlaying the unimportant thinking to make more room for the important thinking, right? This is a way that you could look at, but I think this really assumes self-control on the user. As I mentioned, I'm noticing more and more people fall into this all-in user, which scares me quite a bit, but it is on you to have this part, right? You can make it true that it offlays the unimportant for the important, but this requires self-control. And as we were showing, like how easy it is to find answers to dumb questions, this causes the case of a lot of people losing this self-control here. And so I feel like those with self-control will benefit the most when it comes to this. I think they'll actually find benefit to what they are capable of. Yes, I think we no doubt will lose unassisted knowledge capability, but what we gain is adaptability. And if you have self-control, it shifts quite a bit, right? If you're in the camp of whispering ear, yes, you're going to lose some unassisted knowledge, but you're going to retain enough that it won't matter, right? Do I really need to know the exact function name of a certain interface? Probably not. As long as I have a high level understanding of it, that might be enough. We may not need to go that deep anymore. And I think it's important to note too, I think there's cases where we will always need that. I think there will always be a need for domain knowledge, because at the end of the day, we need somebody that can come up with new ideas. The user can prompt it in a way that gets it to design something we haven't designed before, yes, but how are you going to know how to do this, right? We've got so many years of OS programming. The only person that's going to make some revolutionary choice in this realm is somebody who has domain knowledge. Vibe coder that's never once looked into the low-level details of anything, they're not going to be able to come up with some massively innovative idea. The average user will always benefit from AI. I think there's certain people that will benefit from having domain knowledge. And I'm hoping that as AI becomes more and more prolific for most people, they'll stop doing this and go back over to I think it's okay to do this if it's something you're not doing important, but for the most part, this to me is the right way to do it, and it prevents us from becoming stupid.